There's a mid-sized city in New England that most Americans couldn't find on a map if you gave them 10 seconds and a hint. No beaches, no mountains, no tech campus, no film industry, no reason anyone outside the region should be thinking about it at all. And yet, right now, in that quiet river city, buyers are losing bidding wars against people they will never meet. Homes are vanishing from listing sites before the ink dries on the sign in the yard. And 2 out of every 3 houses sold there last year went for more than the seller was even asking. Not in Austin, not in Miami, not in some glossy Sunbelt boomtown that exploded during the pandemic rush. In Hartford, Connecticut. If you'd told someone 2 years ago that Hartford would outcompete New York City, Los Angeles, and the entire San Francisco Bay Area for the title of hottest housing market in the country, they would have laughed you out of the room. Nobody's laughing anymore. And the story of how a sleepy state capital ended up at the top of that list says a lot more about where American housing is actually headed than most of the crash headlines you've been seeing. This isn't a story about one lucky city catching a wave. It's a story about a set of forces quietly rewriting the map of American housing. Forces that started in the pandemic, accelerated with interest rates, and are now colliding in places nobody was watching closely enough. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why this happened, who's caught in the middle of it, and whether the same thing is already creeping toward a city near you. To understand why Hartford is strange, you first need to understand what's happening everywhere else. Because on paper, the U.S. housing market right now looks tired. Go back to the pandemic years and the numbers were almost cartoonish. Home prices rose at a pace that peaked above 26% in a single year back in the spring of 2021. Buyers were waiving inspections, paying tens of thousands over asking, sight unseen. It was, by any historical measure, insane. But insane doesn't last. By the end of 2022, that runaway growth had slowed to barely 1% a year, and by the following spring, prices had actually fallen compared to 12 months earlier, the first real crack in the pandemic boom. Sales told an even rougher story. Transactions nearly ground to a halt when the pandemic first hit, then surged back so hard that by May of 2021, the number of homes changing hands was up almost 50% year over year. Then rates climbed, affordability collapsed, and by the end of 2022, sales volume had cratered by more than a third compared to the year before. Since then, the market has been trying to find its footing. There was a real recovery through 2024. But heading into this year, that recovery has stalled again. Nationally, home prices are up just over 1% compared to a year ago, essentially flat once you account for inflation. And sales volume is actually down more than 8% year over year. By almost every conventional measure, the American housing market is cooling, and this isn't just noise in the data. It reflects something buyers and sellers all over the country are feeling in real time. Higher borrowing costs have made monthly payments significantly more expensive than they were just a few years ago, even in places where home prices themselves haven't moved much. Sellers who might otherwise list their homes are choosing to wait it out. Buyers who might otherwise jump in are getting priced out of payments they could have easily afforded in 2021. The result is a market that's technically still standing, but moving in slow motion almost everywhere you look. Almost everywhere. Which is exactly what makes Hartford so strange. Because while the rest of the country is catching its breath, Connecticut, and Hartford specifically, is doing the opposite. Prices climbing faster, homes selling quicker, competition getting fiercer, not calmer. In a year defined nationally by hesitation, one small New England market decided to ignore the memo entirely. Here's where the story gets interesting. Researchers who study real estate markets recently built a composite score to rank every state by how hot its housing market actually is right now. Not by price alone, but by a blend of factors. How fast prices are rising, how often homes sell above the asking price, how quickly they sell, and how rarely sellers have to cut their price to find a buyer. Connecticut didn't just make the list, it topped it. A composite score of just under 94, ahead of New Jersey, ahead of Rhode Island, ahead of New York. 7 of the 10 hottest state housing markets in the entire country right now are clustered in the Northeast. And Connecticut sits at the very top of that pile. That regional clustering matters, and it's not an accident. Densely built, older states like Connecticut, New Jersey, and Rhode Island share the same basic constraint. There simply isn't much open land left to build on, and what land does exist is often tied up in restrictive local zoning that's been in place for decades. Compare that to California, which still shows up as one of the more active markets in the country despite carrying one of the highest costs of living in the nation. Its northern metro areas, including San Francisco, San Jose, and Oakland, rank among the hottest large cities anywhere, again largely because it's structurally difficult to add new housing supply there too. The pattern holding across nearly every one of these red-hot markets is the same one. It isn't really about how desirable a place is. It's about how hard it is to build there. Zoom in further, past the state level and down to individual metro areas, and the story sharpens even more. When one of the country's biggest real estate data companies ranked the 50 largest metro areas in America by housing competition for this year, Hartford came out on top. Not New York, not the Bay Area, where median home prices are triple what they are in Connecticut. Hartford. It knocked off Buffalo, which had held the #1 spot for 2 years running. And this wasn't a fluke prediction. The same researchers had flagged Hartford as a rising market the year before, forecasting that it would see the fastest price growth of any major metro in the country. That prediction came true. Home values in Hartford climbed nearly 5% in a single year, faster than any other large metro in America. Now they're forecasting another jump of close to 4% through the rest of this year. The competition numbers are what really tell the story, though. Nation high, 66.4% of homes in Hartford sold for more than the asking price last year. That's not a slight edge for sellers. That's 2/3 of every transaction going into a bidding war and the seller winning. Compare that to the national number, where less than 1/3 of homes sell above asking. Hartford also had one of the lowest shares of price cuts of any major metro in the country. Sellers there almost never need to lower their price because the buyers keep coming regardless. And underneath all of it sits the real driver, inventory. Homes available for sale in the Hartford area are down 63% compared to pre-pandemic levels, the single largest supply gap of any of the 50 biggest metro areas in the United States. There is, quite simply, almost nothing to buy. What makes this even more remarkable is that a completely separate ranking, built by a different research team using different methodology, landed on the exact same answer. When one of the largest listing platforms in the country ranked the top 100 U.S. housing markets for expected growth in both sales and prices this year, Hartford came in first there too. Two unrelated organizations, two different formulas, the same small Connecticut city at the very top of the list. When that happens, it stops looking like a coincidence and starts looking like a real pattern. That same research introduced a term for what's happening here: refuge markets. Places like Hartford, along with nearby Worcester, Massachusetts, and New Haven, Connecticut, that share a specific profile. Inventory down 60% or more from pre-pandemic norms, but prices that have climbed over 16% since 2022 while the national market barely moved at all. And maybe the most surprising detail in the entire story, even after all of this, the typical home in Hartford still costs less than the national median. This isn't an expensive market pricing people out through sheer cost. It's an affordable market getting crushed by demand. It doesn't have the supply to absorb. So the obvious question is, why? Why is a modest New England capital suddenly short on homes when builders across the Sun Belt were throwing up entire subdivisions during the same stretch of years? Part of the answer is structural. Hartford, like most of New England, is old. Not old in a quaint, charming downtown kind of way. Old in the sense that its housing stock was largely built out decades ago, the land is already developed, and there simply isn't the open space to build thousands of new subdivisions the way you can outside Phoenix or Dallas. Where a Sunbelt developer might buy a few hundred acres of farmland and break ground on an entire new neighborhood within a year. Doing the same thing near Hartford would mean navigating layers of local zoning boards, historic preservation rules, and simply not having that much contiguous, open land to work with in the first place. New construction in these markets lags well behind the national average as a result, And when new homes do get built, they carry a price premium at least double what you'd see nationally. Because building here is slower, more expensive, and more tightly regulated. So even when builders want to respond to the demand, the region's own geography and governance make it a much slower process than in the newer, more sprawling metros further south and west. But the deeper, more urgent reason is something economists have started calling the lock-in effect, and it's reshaping housing markets all over the country, not just in Connecticut. Here's how it works. Millions of homeowners refinanced or bought during the ultra-low rate years of 2020 and 2021 when 30-year mortgages were sitting around 2.5% to 3%. Fast forward to today, and rates have more than doubled. If one of those homeowners wants to sell and buy a new place, they're not just paying a higher price for the next house. They're trading a 2.5% mortgage for something closer to 7%. For a lot of people, that math simply doesn't work, even if they'd genuinely like to move. So they don't. They stay put. And it's worth pausing on just how large that gap really is in dollar terms. A homeowner sitting on a 2.5% mortgage from 2021 who sells and buys a similarly priced home today at closer to 7% isn't just paying a little more each month. Depending on the size of the loan, that swing can mean hundreds, sometimes well over $1,000 extra a month, for the exact same amount of debt. Looked at that way, it's not really a mystery why homeowners are choosing to renovate the kitchen they already have instead of listing the house and shopping for a new one. Multiply that decision by hundreds of thousands of homeowners across the region, and you get exactly what Hartford is experiencing. A market where almost nobody wants to sell because selling means giving up the best mortgage rate they'll ever have in their lifetime. Current data puts the available supply in Connecticut at under 1.5 months. For context, a market is generally considered balanced, somewhere between 5 and 6 months of supply. Connecticut isn't close to balanced. It's a full-blown seller's market, and the lock-in effect is the engine keeping it that way. Local news coverage from the region has been full of exactly this story, told through individual families instead of statistics. Homeowners who bought right at the end of 2020, locked into historically low rates, and now openly say they're staying exactly where they are. Not because they don't want more space or a different neighborhood, but because moving would mean handing back the best financial decision they ever made. Multiply that mindset across an entire state, and you start to see why the shelves are empty. If sellers are frozen in place, who exactly is fueling 66% of homes selling over asking? The answer runs straight up Interstate 95 and the Metro North rail line from New York. Buyers priced out of New York City, and increasingly priced out of expensive Fairfield County right on Connecticut's own southern border, have been pushing further north and east in search of something they can actually afford. Remote and hybrid work loosened the old requirement of living within an easy commute of a Manhattan office, and that gave buyers permission to look somewhere they never would have considered 5 years ago. The data backs this up directly. Nearly 40% of the people browsing listings in these newly hot Northeast metros are coming from outside the region entirely, up sharply from where that number sat before rates started climbing back in 2022. These aren't just local families moving across town. A meaningful chunk of this demand is coming from people who used to be New York buyers, now becoming Connecticut buyers, chasing more space and a lower price tag for the same money. And it's not isolated to Hartford. The exact same refuge market pattern is playing out in Worcester, Massachusetts, and in New Haven, right here in Connecticut, which landed in the top 10 of that same national ranking. Different cities, same story. Overlooked, historically affordable, and suddenly overwhelmed by buyers who got squeezed out of somewhere more expensive. It also helps that Hartford has more going for it economically than its low profile suggests. The region has been home to some of the largest insurance companies in the world for well over a century, giving it a stable base of white-collar employment that never really depended on any single tech boom or industry fad. Add a major public university system nearby, a slowly reviving downtown, and a cost of living that still looks reasonable next to New York or Boston, and you start to see why out-of-state buyers searching for somewhere else kept landing here specifically, instead of scattering randomly across the map. Here's the part of this story that really should stop you in your tracks, because it flips the entire pandemic housing narrative on its head. Rewind to 2021. If you were watching real estate trends back then, you knew exactly where the action was. Texas, and Arizona. Austin, Fort Worth, Arlington, all three ranked among the 15 hottest housing markets in the entire country. Phoenix and Mesa weren't far behind. Builders poured into these Sunbelt cities, throwing up new subdivisions at a pace nobody in New England could hope to match, chasing remote workers who were fleeing expensive coastal cities for cheaper square footage and better weather. Fast forward to now, and those same cities have collapsed to the bottom 15 of the national rankings. Austin, Fort Worth, Phoenix, Mesa. The pandemic's biggest winners are today's coldest markets. What happened? A few things stacked on top of each other. Builders in these Sunbelt metros responded to the pandemic rush by building aggressively, which is exactly what you'd want in a market that's short on housing, except it meant that by the time demand cooled, these cities suddenly had more supply than buyers to absorb it. At the same time, the home price surges of 2021 and 2022 pushed affordability in the wrong direction, right as mortgage rates were climbing too. And then came the return to office mandates, pulling a meaningful slice of those remote workers back toward the metro areas they'd left behind in the first place. Meanwhile, the Northeast had the opposite problem the entire time. It never overbuilt because it structurally couldn't. There simply wasn't the land, the zoning, or the appetite for the kind of rapid construction Texas and Arizona saw. So when demand shifted back toward these markets, driven by affordability-seeking buyers and the lock-in effect freezing what little supply existed, there was nothing there to absorb the pressure. Scarcity met demand, and the result is Hartford sitting at number 1 while Austin sits near the bottom. Think about how strange that would have sounded during the peak of the pandemic. Back then, the entire narrative was that dense, older northeastern cities were finished. That remote work had permanently broken the link between where people worked and where they lived, and that everyone with the means to do so would keep moving toward cheaper, sunnier, newer housing stock indefinitely. For a couple of years, that story looked true, and then the incentives flipped. Rates rose, prices in the boom towns caught up to and in some cases exceeded what people had been trying to escape in the first place. Return to office policies chipped away at the flexibility that made the whole migration possible. It's a pretty clean lesson in how housing markets actually move, and one worth remembering the next time a headline declares some city permanently over or permanently the future. It's rarely about which city is more desirable in some abstract permanent sense. It's about supply meeting demand at a specific moment in time. And in Hartford's case, demand slamming into a wall of supply that simply isn't there, while 1,300 miles away, the opposite imbalance is playing out in reverse. None of this is abstract if you're actually trying to buy or even rent in this market right now. Rents have followed the same upward pressure as home prices in several Connecticut towns. In one Hartford area community, rent climbed roughly 9% in a single year. Nearby towns saw similar jumps. Interestingly, a couple of towns in the region actually saw rents dip slightly, and local housing experts point to new construction as the reason. Wherever developers manage to add even a modest number of new units, competition eases just a little, which is itself a pretty direct demonstration of the entire problem. Supply, or the lack of it, is driving almost everything happening in this market. For renters trying to become buyers, the math is brutal. Mortgage rates sitting in the 6 to 8% range mean a monthly payment on the same house costs dramatically more today than it would have in 2021, even before you account for the fact that the price of the house itself has climbed too. Real estate agents in the region have been blunt about it. Buyers need to show up with every possible advantage. Financing lined up in advance, flexibility on closing timelines, willingness to move fast the moment something new hits the market. Because the moment a well-priced listing appears, it's gone. Talk to agents working towns like West Hartford, and the description is almost always the same. A house lists on one day and is gone, under contract within 24 to 48 hours. Not because every buyer is overpaying wildly, but because there are simply enough qualified people competing for the same handful of homes that speed itself has become a competitive advantage. Waiting a weekend to think it over isn't a luxury this market extends to buyers anymore. And this isn't confined to any one income bracket. Local reporting has captured renters spending months searching for a basic apartment near local universities, families locked out of buying despite steady careers, and longtime homeowners fully aware that their own low mortgage rate has become a kind of golden handcuff, keeping them in a home that no longer fits their life, simply because moving would cost too much. There's a quieter version of this squeeze too, one that doesn't show up in headlines as easily. It's the family that outgrew their starter home years ago but can't justify trading a low fixed rate for a bigger mortgage on a bigger house. It's the recent retiree who'd love to downsize but finds that smaller homes are just as competitive and just as expensive as the one they already own. Every layer of this market is technically frozen in place by the same underlying math, and the result is a kind of gridlock that touches almost everyone, whether they're actively house hunting or not. So where does this actually go from here? Is Hartford, and Connecticut more broadly, headed for some kind of correction, or is this the new normal? Most of the people who study this market closely land in the same place. A crash is unlikely. This isn't bubble behavior, where prices are disconnected from underlying demand. It's the opposite. It's demand running headlong into a genuine structural shortage of homes. Forecasts for the rest of this year point to continued, moderate price growth across Connecticut, somewhere in the range of 2 to 4% statewide, with Hartford itself expected to lead the pack at closer to 4%. Inventory is projected to tick up modestly, maybe 5 to 10%, as a handful of new listings trickle in and a few locked-in owners eventually decide the timing works for them after all. But a modest uptick in supply doesn't undo a 63% deficit overnight. This market isn't going to loosen up quickly. It's also worth sitting with just how far prices have already climbed. Homes in Connecticut are now running somewhere around 80% above where they sat before the pandemic began. That's not a bubble about to pop. Pandemic-era gains rarely just evaporate. But it is a permanently higher baseline that isn't reverting to what buyers remember from a decade ago. Mortgage rates themselves are expected to hover in a fairly narrow band through the rest of the year, generally somewhere in the 6 to 7% range. That's not the relief rate-sensitive buyers have been hoping for, but it's also not the kind of spike that would push the market into real distress. Absent some larger economic shock, the most likely path forward looks less like a dramatic headline and more like a slow, grinding continuation of what's already happening. Tight supply, steady demand, and prices that keep climbing, just not at the breakneck pace of 2021. Step back from the day-to-day numbers, and Hartford's rise isn't really a story about Hartford at all. It's a symptom of something much bigger happening across the entire country. Millions of homeowners locked into rates they'll never see again, refusing to sell, while a shrinking pool of available homes gets fought over by buyers who've been priced out of somewhere more expensive. It happened in a quiet New England capital nobody was watching. There's a real chance it's already happening in a city near you, and you just haven't seen the headline yet. If there's a practical lesson buried in all of this, it's that the old assumptions about which cities are hot and which ones are safe don't hold up the way they used to. The Sun Belt boomtowns that felt unstoppable in 2021 are cooling off, while overlooked capitals with no glamour and no marketing budget are quietly becoming the most competitive markets in the country. For buyers, that means the smartest move might not be chasing the city everyone's already talking about. It might be looking one ring outside of it, at the refuge markets still flying under the radar. For sellers sitting on a rock-bottom mortgage rate, it means understanding that staying put isn't stubbornness anymore. It's math. So here's the real question worth sitting with. If a sleepy state capital with no beaches, no mountains, and no obvious draw can quietly become the most competitive housing market in the country, what does that tell you about the next city that's about to do the same thing, right under everyone's nose, while all the attention stays fixed on the places that already had their moment? If this kind of deep dive into what's really moving the housing market is something you want more of, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this video reach more people who'd find it useful. And if you're not subscribed yet, now's a good time. There's a lot more of this coming, breaking down the numbers behind the headlines before anyone else is talking about them. Drop a comment and let me know. Is your city the next Hartford or the next Austin? I'll see you in the next one.
Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more educational content. And as always, thank you so much for watching our videos. See you next time.